Will Pyle is an associate professor of economics and director of the program in Russian and East European Studies. He is also a research fellow of the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan and has held visiting research positions at the Bank of Finland Institute for Economies in Transition and the Center for European Integration Studies in Bonn. His research, which focuses broadly on the evolution of markets and market-supporting institutions in post-socialist countries, has received support from the National Council on Eurasian and East European Research, the William Davidson Institute, the International Research and Exchanges Board of the Fulbright Hays Fellowship Program. Will's published research has appeared in the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization, the Journal of Comparative Economics, Economics of Transition, and other outlets. Will earned a BA degree in history from Harvard and an MA in Russian and East European Studies from Indiana University, and finally a PhD from Duke University in economics. The title of his talk today is Political Power and Property Rights in Russia's Regions. Please join me in welcoming Will.
Thanks, Charlotte, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to you and Martha as well for helping to organize the event, and thanks to all of you for showing up on this beautiful snowy afternoon. While I know I have your attention, right at the beginning, while I have this audience of Russophiles here in front of me, I wanted to briefly bring your attention to a couple of events that we have upcoming here at the Robert A. Jones House in the next couple of weeks relevant to Russia. The first one is next Friday at 4:30. We're welcoming Paul Gregory of the Hoover Institution and the University of Houston, who's going to be talking on the economics of coercion during Stalin's Great Terror. Professor Gregory has had perhaps more access to the Stalin-era archives than any other Western historian or economic historian, and he's just out with a new book that he might be sharing some of the findings of. The book's title is Lenin's Brain and Other Tales from the Secret Soviet Archives. He also has recently published The Political Economy of Stalinism. And then on March 11th, Tuesday, March 11th, we're welcoming Peter Rutland of Wesleyan University's Government Department, and he'll be here to talk about the presidential election, which is imminent in Russia. That's scheduled for March 2nd. But Professor Rutland will be here on the 11th of March. The talk that I'm going to give about political power and property rights in Russia is going to be, given that theme, in some sense unusual. I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on Vladimir Putin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on the oligarchs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on the energy sector. That is, my interest in this talk is not going to be so much on the commanding heights of the economy or what's happening in the halls of power in the Kremlin. Rather, what I want to do is take kind of a bottom-up perspective on Russia's political economy and highlight the often neglected variation in regional politics, the tremendous differences across Russia's regions in political regimes, and highlight as well some of the survey evidence that I've collected from Russian firms, Russian industrial enterprises, and the organizations that represent them. And in highlighting those two things, this variation across space and politics, and then the survey evidence, I hope to be able to tell a story or present evidence that's consistent with a story in which politics explain the security of property rights. Okay, so it's a story that's going to give primacy in a way to politics. And so the Jeff Cations of the world should kind of like that, I hope, and the others who are students of politics as well. So the story that I want to tell, the framework that I want to fit this story into, kind of goes as follows. The political institution, particularly the distribution of political power in a particular region, influences the rules of the economic game in that region. In particular, the enforcement of property rights and the incentives that political actors, that state officials have to abstain from threatening the property rights of private firms. If firms feel secure in their property rights, then they'll be more likely to invest. They'll be more likely to take a long-term perspective and engage in productive activities. Okay, so that's the basic outline of the story. Now, this outline is actually a very kind of popular model for understanding some of the biggest questions in economics today. For instance, why are some nations rich and some nations poor? There's an awful lot of work that's being done by economic historians looking at this question and using property rights, the emergence of good property rights institutions, as the explanatory variable that explains that differences across countries in wealth. So unbundling that chain that I had up on the board before and thinking about the top two blocks. The first block in that chain was the distribution of political power. What do I mean by the distribution of political power? Well, political power, I'm going to say, is a function of two different variables within a region. It's a function of what others have called the political institutions. Specifically, where a particular region fits on the spectrum from authoritarianism to democracy. What's the degree of political competition in the region? The other variable that makes up the distribution of political power is the ability of certain subgroups within society to successfully organize and exert pressure on state officials. The ability of these subgroups, and particularly I'm going to be interested in subgroups within the business community, to solve what political scientists and economists call the collective action problem, to organize and then do something with that organization. These two different variables potentially can both influence the security of property rights for individual firms. And these are arguments that are made by others. I'm looking to confirm them in the Russian Federation. So one argument that's made is that greater degrees of political competition, greater degrees of democracy constrain state officials and make them less likely to threaten the property rights of firms. That is, that there's a positive relationship between political competition and more secure property rights. Another argument that's made, and this is that's made by political scientists who've gone into countries in the developing world, into emerging market economies, they make the arguments that business organizations, organizations for collective action in the business community, often exert pressure on public officials to make sure that they respect the property rights of firms within their jurisdiction. So arguments have been made positively linking both these variables to the security of property rights. I'm also interested in this research here in something that doesn't receive a lot of attention from either economists or political scientists. That is the interaction of these two variables. And specifically, does the impact of collective action or business organization change as the degree of political competition in a particular region changes? Now, when I talk about property rights security, specifically what am I referring to? I'm referring to two things that I feel I can measure with my survey evidence. First of all, do firms in a particular region have an ability to exercise some influence over the rules and regulations that govern that region? Or are they purely subject to the whim and the caprice of bureaucrats and state officials? Unexpected increases in taxes, unexpected and non-uniform introduction of regulatory barriers. Are they subject to that bureaucratic state official caprice or not? Can they influence the design of new rules and regulations? And a second dimension of property rights is, can firms restrain what some have called the grabbing hand of the state? State officials that are looking for bribes in exchange for certain services or not engaging in certain actions. Okay. Now, I'm not an expert on Russian regional politics, and what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily based upon the research of Joel Moses, who's a political scientist out at Iowa State University. And Moses wrote a piece that appeared in a leading journal a couple years back, in which he made the case that, yes, if you go out into the Russian regions and you look at the elections for the post of governor, or you look at the elections to the regional Duma, the regional legislatures, or the mayoral elections, that these are not pristine elections without any irregularities. There's a lot that's wrong with what's happening in terms of the elections. There are a lot of irregularities. There's corruption with the electoral commissions. There's evidence that candidates will pay for kind of false stories to appear about their competitors in the local and regional newspapers. There's even, and this might be unique to Russia, I haven't heard of any evidence to this effect from other countries, but there's this phenomenon called the dvoyniki. That is that candidates running for an electoral post will recruit somebody with the same name as their opponent, maybe even 2 or 3 people with the same name as their opponent, get them all on the ballots to confuse the voters. So this sort of stuff that we wouldn't associate with kind of a mature, well-functioning democracy, this goes on quite regularly. But Moses' point is that even though this is going on, just to quote from him here, despite the prevalence of autocratic political regimes in some Russian regions, a lively and healthy competition for public offices and elections can be found in many regions over the past decade. In these regions where there's a greater degree of political competition in Russia, outcomes are uncertain. They're really vicious battles between different interests, different political interests, often between the mayor's office in the largest city in a particular region and the governor of that region. Or they're fierce battles between economic interests within a particular region. But these have produced, in some regions, very competitive elections for, again, governor's positions, mayoral positions, and the regional legislatures. So elections matter in this sense. And another thing that's true about these elections is that because their result is accepted by the competing parties, this is an indication that, at least at some level, despite all we read in the Western press to the contrary, there are seeds of some kind of nascent democracy taking root in portions of Russia. Okay, if we're interested in regional political variation, the differences in political competition across Russian regions, it'd be really nice if we could actually measure that. Economists are, they're really big into quantification. If you can't quantify it, it really isn't worth talking about. And so I was really happy to see a couple years ago, there was a survey or an index that was compiled under the leadership of a man named Igor Yakovenko, who is the head of the Union of Russian Journalists. And he got together with a group of foundations in Moscow, independent foundations, and they tried to, in some way, capture the variation across regions in Russia in the degree of electoral competition. And they tried to come up with an index that wasn't based upon just expert opinions, people sitting around a table and saying, well, out there in Khabarovsk, is it a 2 or a 3? That wasn't the methodology. The methodology used was, in some sense, a more objective methodology. That is, they looked at actual electoral data, the returns from, again, the regional Duma elections and the regional gubernatorial election. Now, I should clarify that governors in Russian regions, and Russia has about 85 regions right now. Governors in Russian regions, which include the city of Moscow and St. Petersburg, so they're treated as regions, are no longer elected. This is something that's relatively new. It's just true of the past couple years. It's part of the Putin reforms. But during the period 1995 to 2005, Russian governors were elected. The legislatures in the region continue to be elected freely. Now, the folks under Yakovenko's direction tried to come up with this objective measure of regional democracy. So what did they look at? They looked at the frequency of turnover in the regional governorship during this 10-year period. They looked at the difference, the vote gap between the top vote getter and the second vote getter. The closer that gap, indicator of greater electoral competition. The share of seats held by United Russia, which is really the party of power, the dominant party now, the one that Putin will step out and lead after he steps down, we believe, from the presidency in just a little bit. Where the share of seats held in a regional legislature by the party of power, by United Russia, is positively correlated with less democracy. Okay, that's how they interpreted that. The threshold for a party to qualify for seats in the regional parliament, the higher that threshold in order to qualify for seats, that's taken as a marker of less democracy. Voter participation rate. And here, voter participation rate enters into their calculation of electoral competition or democracy, perhaps in just the opposite way than you might expect. Here they look at a 99% participation rate in, say, Tatarstan, and they take that as, well, it's the political leaders in that republic, in that region, that are driving people to vote, effectively using coercion. So less participation actually is entering into their index as greater electoral democracy. The share of voting against all, again, a measure of more free will being exercised by the electorate. And finally, the difference between the percentage of votes received by parties in the regional Duma and the percentage of seats held by those parties. The closer the closer that relationship there between the percentage of votes and the percentage of seats, the greater the feeling that the will of the electorate was being well represented and therefore higher on the democracy scale. And so, putting all that together, they come up with a ranking. They had it on an index from 5 being highly competitive, highly democratic, and again, this is in a relative sense, all the way down to 1 being very undemocratic. So you can all pick out your favorite regions, your favorite autonomous oblasts, and see where they appear in this list. This is not a comprehensive list in any sense. This is only about 40 or half of the actual regions in Russia. They're regions that I have data from my survey of firms and business organizations. You can see that Moscow, the city of Moscow, where Luzhkov has presided for the entire Yeltsin and Putin periods, is relatively low down on this list. It comes in with a ranking of 2. We've got some kind of not surprising characters down here at the bottom, some of these ethnic republics where the same folks who were there in the Soviet era continue to be there and control politics with iron fists. And you notice that St. Petersburg's a little bit further up the list. Again, St. Petersburg and Moscow are treated as regions within the Russian political system. Let me quickly talk now about the surveys of firms and business organizations that I conducted with the help of the Levada Center. Now, the Levada Center is a Russian polling organization based in Moscow. It was founded by Yuri Levada. And those of you who know the Soviet period well, you know that Yuri Levada was one of the first, maybe the first sociologist in the Soviet Union. He was the first sociologist to teach a course in sociology at Moscow State University. And during the 1950s, a period of relative thaw in Soviet politics, he actually began to introduce public opinion polling to the Soviet Union. Now, he ran afoul of the state in the mid to late 1960s, the Soviet state, when he demonstrated with some polling data that folks weren't actually reading the stuffy and kind of long-winded editorials that appear in Pravda on a daily basis. And so, because of that, he wasn't able to publish his research, but he was rehabilitated during the Gorbachev era, and he established this public opinion research firm that is now used by a lot of Western scholars, and they often release public opinion surveys in Russia, oftentimes asking what you would think in the current Russian environment are very sensitive questions about trends in terms of press freedoms, or what's your attitude towards what's going on in Chechnya, these sorts of things. And they were asking these sorts of questions while I was conducting my survey. And so I had this fear that any moment they were about to be shut down because they were stepping on toes in the Kremlin. Fortunately, that hasn't been the case, and they continue to be very brave in the sorts of questions that they're asking. When I was working with them, I conducted 3 different types of surveys. In the fall of 2003, I conducted a survey of firms across over half the Russian regions, in which firms were just asked in a telephone survey, are you a member or not of a business organization? some sort of nonprofit organization that represents business interests. We found from that survey, that telephone survey, that about a third of the firms sampled reported being members of such an organization. That was followed up by two much longer surveys, face-to-face surveys, carried out by the Levada Center personnel in 40-plus regions across Russia. Some of those surveys went to Russian industrial enterprises, a little over 600 Russian industrial enterprises. About half of them were under 100 employees in size, about half over. There was pretty good representation across different industrial branches within that sample. Almost all industrial branches were represented with the exception of energy, just considering the energy sector very unique in the Russian context. And then there was a survey instrument that went out to business associations as well. These are chambers of commerce type organizations. Most of them were organizations that drew in firms, drew in their members from many different sectors of the economy. Some of these associations were representative of just a single sector. For the purposes of what I'm presenting here, I'm most interested in the regional associations that were part of that survey. That is, the associations that just drew their membership from a single region or a single city. Of the 200 associations that I surveyed, that's about 3/4 of the sample. I'm a sucker for these maps. And so last year I asked our GIS intern, yes, we have a GIS intern now here at Middlebury College, to put together a map that gives some sense of the spatial distribution of the respondents to my survey. So this is the spatial distribution of the firm respondents, where each one of those areas is a different region or territory. You can see that there's some regions where I don't have coverage, but a lot of the regions I do have coverage. There's pretty good representation from Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are the red circles there. Here's a representation of the spatial distribution in terms of the Business Association survey. You can see that there's a very large number, roughly 50 who were surveyed in Moscow. Most of those Moscow-based associations were federal level associations. That is, they're drawing in their members from many different regions. Most of the ones that you see represented by the colored spaces elsewhere are these regional associations that I'm interested in. Again, they're defined by drawing their membership from just a single region or city. Okay, a little bit of descriptive data on the two samples. The left-hand column here represents when firms joined. If you were a member of an association, and by construction, half the firms that were part of my sample were members of associations, half the firms were not. If you were a member of an association, or two associations, I asked about up to 2 associations that you might belong to, when did you join? And you can see here that there's a particular uptick in joining these business organizations during the Putin years, 1999 on. Now this is interesting because there are 2 potential explanations for that as I see it. One is that we know from other countries' experiences that generally membership in voluntary business organizations rises with national income. Firms have greater disposable income that may allow them to absorb the membership fees. So we know that Russia has grown since 1999 steadily, so that might be what's driving this uptick in membership. Actually, the explanation that I like better and seems to resonate more with the Russians that I speak with is the period from 1999 to 2004 is also the period that coincides with the start of Putin's term in power. His brief term as prime minister and later as president, starting in 2000. Now, why would Putin's rise to power matter for membership in these organizations? When Putin came into power, one of the things that he said is that he was going to put an end to the policies that had prevailed during the Yeltsin era, in which individual oligarchs, very wealthy business people, had kind of back channels, informal channels to the levers of political power. Putin said we're going to usher in an era of equidistance. All business people will be treated equally. Now, of course, that hasn't come to pass. But this is a signal that he sent, a very strong signal. And now every year he holds meetings that are televised, shown on the nightly news, with representatives of leading business organizations, the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, the Federal Chamber of Commerce, a group representing small business called Opora, and Putin has signaled in this way that now political officials should deal with business not through back channels, not through individual negotiations that may lead to some sort of corrupt relations, but out in the open with formal organizations representing the business community. And when I provide this explanation, most of the Russians in the audience say, yeah, that makes a lot more sense than just Russia has grown in this 5-year period of time. Okay, this slide right here tells us something about the regional associations that I'm interested in. Most regional associations really aren't that large. And these are chambers of commerce organizations. In average terms, they have about 16 full-time paid employees. A lot of them have people working on their staffs doing pro bono work. They have legal counsel providing advice to members, legal advice to members on a pro bono basis. So on average, about 16 full-time paid members, same numbers in part-time or volunteers. Also see here something about the numbers of firms represented in the membership rolls of these regional associations. You add up the numbers in the left-hand column here. You can see by the different sizes of the enterprises, on average, these regional associations are comprised of about 100 firms. There are a lot of firms that have chosen, for whatever reason, not to join these business associations. The best estimates put the membership rates right now at about a third, maybe a little bit higher even now. You can see here that the regional associations that I'm looking at, about 2/3 of them are located in their regional capital, and about 1/3 of them represent just firms from a single city, with the rest representing firms from the entire region. Okay? What do these associations do? Okay, so the associations all were answering a survey in which they were given a menu to choose from. How important, one question was, how important are these following services to your members? That is, how important are these services in terms of explaining new membership over the past 3 years? And you can see in terms of the most important, and this was on a 1 to 5 scale, these regional associations are saying, firms are joining our association because we provide them with services, informational services, where they can sell their output to. We provide them with legal and consulting services, how to get their business registered, what happens in the event of an inspection that takes a bad turn. In terms of what I'm interested in here, that is the interface between the business community and political actors, these are the 3 services that are most relevant. And you can see they're second, third, and then I think 7th in importance. The associations say they're getting new members because they provide services, they provide the opportunity to lobby government officials. They provide protection from illegitimate government interference. And I'll come back to what I mean by illegitimate government interference in a second. But those are 2 of the most important services they provide, and they also provide services relating to helping firms participate in the development of new rules, regulations, and legislation. Okay. Moving on here to these 3 types of services that I just highlighted. The first 2 columns are responses of firms. The firm survey. How important, if you're a member of an association, are these particular services to the financial well-being of your enterprise? Now, again, they were given a 1 to 5 scale. If they answered 4, important, or 5, very important, I took that to be saying that the firms are saying that these services that we're receiving from the business associations are important to their financial well-being. You can see that between 10 and 20% of firms that are members are saying that these sorts of services are important to their financial well-being. So it's far from all of the firms that are members are acknowledging that these services are somehow important to them. Over here, where we look at associations in columns 3 and 4, ask the same question. How important do you feel these services are within the portfolio of services that you're providing to your members? Now, these are the associations that are responding, and so they're much more prone to kind of exaggerate the importance of what they're doing. And so they're coming in with 4s and 5s on these services at much higher rates. Now, one thing that's interesting to point out is I asked them how important were these services at the founding, when your organization was founded, and how important are they now? You can see the big mover here is this particular service of participating in the legislative process. The associations are being brought into the legislative process to a much greater degree than they were when they were founded. And most of them were founded back in the mid-1990s. So something is changing in the political landscape, kind of a formalization of businesses' participation in the rulemaking process. Okay, a little bit of regression output here. And I'll try to be very brief and simple with the explanation. I asked associations I asked associations about those 11 different services that they provide, and I was interested in the relative importance of those different services, particularly the relative importance of these particular services that relate specifically to businesses' relationship with government officials. Okay? So what this slide is showing us here is that controlling for a whole host of factors here that you see on the left-hand column, that associations in less democratic regions are more apt to rank relatively highly the importance of their services in protecting their businesses from illegitimate government interference. And those associations in the less democratic regions are more likely to give relative importance to the opportunity to lobby government officials. So if you're a member of an association in these less democratic regions, then these services become particularly important to join. Okay, moving on. Well, what explains association membership? And I talked a little bit about my firm data now. What explains association membership? Well, generally, firms that are larger are more likely to join. And this is a pattern that we see is true of Chamber of Commerce organizations or voluntary business associations around the world. Larger firms are more apt to join. We also see that firms that were established after 1991, which is about 40% of my sample, are more apt to have joined these associations. That finding is consistent with the idea that these associations are providing new firms with a channel to state officials. Old firms may have less formal backdoor channels that give them access to state officials. Also like to highlight right here that firms in more democratic regions that according to that index of electoral competition are more likely to have joined these associations. Okay, now turning to property rights. How do I measure a firm's property rights? Okay, two questions in the survey that all the firms answered as to that relates to this notion of secure property rights. First of all, firms were all asked, have in the past 3 years you've been invited to participate in regional working groups that are developing new rules and regulations? And if so, to what degree do you feel you've been able to influence the final form of those new rules and regulations that have been developed at the regional level? Okay? And you can see that 145 firms are responding here. That means roughly a quarter of the firms that I surveyed said that they've been invited to participate in these regional working groups. And you can see there is a fair degree of variation across their own self-perceived influence on the final forms of new rules and regulations. About half of the firms are saying, yes, we were invited to participate, but we don't feel like our voice was heard in any way, at least insofar as we weren't able to influence the final form of the new rules and regulations. But we are seeing some firms here that say that they have a voice in determining what those new institutions, those new rules and regulations look like. That's one way I'm trying to capture firms' property rights, their ability to influence the institutional environment, to not be totally subject to the caprice of bureaucrats, the whim of bureaucrats. The second way I'm measuring property rights is, to what extent, let me back up. Firms were all asked, in the past 3 years, have you been on the receiving end of a government inspection that you felt resulted in some sort of illegitimate or illegal outcome? Okay? These firms are constantly being inspected by different government agencies, and I'm going to get back to this point in just a second. They're constantly being inspected, so much so that when Putin came into office in 2001, he helped push through new legislation that limited the number of visits that particular government and agencies, the bureaucrats from those agencies, could make to individual firms. Even though that legislation was passed in 2001, these frequent illegitimate inspections continue. So firms were asked, have you experienced something like this in the previous 3 years? Did you feel the outcome of that inspection was illegitimate? And if so, did you appeal? Okay? Some firms just decided to do nothing. 41% of the firms that were on the receiving end of an inspection that they felt was illegitimate said that they appealed. Some of those appealed to the local court. Some of those appealed to some non-judicial government body, some government agency, the superior of the bureaucrat maybe that conducted the inspection. Now I'm taking that choice to appeal as representing the firm's belief that it has the ability to overturn the results of the illegitimate inspection. That is, it's a marker of more secure property rights. Some firms just throw up their hands, nothing we can do, we'll make amends with the bureaucrat that's conducted this illegitimate inspection. Oftentimes there's a bribe that changes hands. So picking up on this theme of illegitimate inspections, this is actually from a manual produced by a Russian business association. It's helping firms understand about the inspection process. And clockwise around this picture here, you have different types of inspectors that can show up at the door of a business. So for instance, we've got the fire inspector. Actually, this is very much in the news these days because the fire inspector just shut down European University in St. Petersburg because of a fire code violation. Of course, there was some other political reason for it, but fire inspectors show up, and they look to see whether or not the business is abiding by the fire code. We've got the tax agencies. We've got the Internal Affairs Ministry. We've got the building code inspector, and here the representative of the Consumer Protection Agency. All these government agencies can send inspectors to see if businesses are abiding by the rules on the books. Now, in this particular pamphlet that was put together by a business association, the firms were told how to respond to these inspections. And so here's a typical businessman who's been approached by a government inspector, and the members of the business association are being exhorted through this pamphlet to make sure you check the identity of the guy who shows up, make sure all his paperwork's in order. But if something untoward should happen, if you feel, and the title of this particular page right here is, what happens if something illegitimate happens? What happens effectively if a bribe is asked for? Or the inspector says that something's wrong when in fact nothing's wrong. He's just trying to use his state power in order to extract a corrupt bribe payment from the firm. Well, then this tells you, and of course there's a lot more text to back up these pictures, but you don't want to see the text, how you can appeal an illegitimate inspection. You can take it to the court system, you can take it to the supervisor of that particular bureaucrat, various ways of appealing. Okay, so what explains those firms that are choosing to appeal? Well, first of all, we see here that the passive response, does not appeal, is correlated negatively when controlling for these other factors with being a member of a regional business association. So this is actually evidence that's consistent with this information from the associations having an effect. That is, firms learn from their membership in these associations how to respond. They've shared experiences with each other. They know what to do in case something like an illegitimate inspection takes place. And so we see firms that are members of regional associations right there are more likely to appeal to a court. They're more likely to go to a local government body in the event of one of these illegitimate inspections. We can also see that behavior is also correlated with size. Larger firms are more likely to take their disputes to a government agency. And this makes sense. Deeper pockets, they can afford their own in-house counsel. They can go to a government body and potentially use the leverage of their larger workforces to extract concessions from government officials. Some of these business associations actually, as I mentioned before, have effectively legal SWAT teams on call. So particularly when small businesses on the receiving end of one of these inspections, they call up the association to which they're members, and the association dispatches their counsel in order to check out the papers and check out the results of a particular inspection activity. The final two property rights variables that I'm interested in here are, first of all, in the previous 3 years, was your firm able to influence the results of regional laws, new regional laws and regulations? And the final one is, in the previous 3 years, did your firm expand or renovate its capital stock? Firms that feel secure in their property rights, taking a longer-term perspective, are more apt to invest. And what's particularly interesting about those pluses and minus signs that are in the dotted boxes is that there appears to be evidence, first of all, that firms that are members of regional business associations are more apt to have influenced the design of new rules and regulations. They're also more apt to have invested in their capital stock. Firms that are in more electorally competitive regions are more apt to have influenced the design of new rules and regulations and invested in their capital stock. But there's also a very interesting interaction effect between the two. And that interaction effect is picked up here in these negative signs. And just for those of you who've had a little bit of regression or statistics, the bigger pluses and minuses represent statistical significance at the 1% level. So we can say with a fair degree of confidence that there's a strong correlation between these variables on the left-hand side and the variables on top. Okay? Now what that negative sign means is that firms that aren't members of business associations are better off being in a democracy, okay, in terms of the security of their property rights. But if you're in a less democratic region, if you want more secure property rights, you better be a member of a business association. So kind of the social sciencey conclusion to the talk here is going back to this diagram. Political competition seems to be regions in which there's greater political competition, greater democracy, seem to have firms which have stronger property rights. Firms that are members of organizations for collective action, these business associations, seem to have stronger property rights. And there seems to be a relationship between the two to suggest that collective action or membership in a business association substitutes for an absence of political competition. That is, if you want property rights, stronger property rights, and you're in a less politically competitive environment, then you better join a business association. Okay. So that's the social science conclusion to the talk. What does this all mean for Russia and how we should think about Russia? Well, just very briefly, by way of conclusion, the dominant narrative of Russian political economy over the past 10 years has been one that under Putin's leadership, political power has been centralized. Greater control of the media, particularly the television, the establishment of seven federal districts in which Putin is appointing his own representatives to ensure that his will is carried out in the regions. These sorts of measures were carried out in order to centralize power. And the notion is that that centralization of political power has gone part and parcel with, first, a weakening of society or a growing passivity of civil society, including the business community. This is the narrative that's told in the wake of what happened to Kharkovsky and Yukos, that after Yukos was effectively nationalized, taken over by the Russian government, the business community as a whole became much more malleable, much more passive. Also part of this narrative is that the centralization of political power has led to a greater degree of uniformity or homogeneity in politics across space within Russia. Now, I don't want to dispute that basic story. It was certainly Putin's intention when he came into office 9 years ago that he wanted to put an end to, in some sense, the anarchy of the Yeltsin era and centralize power. And he's done an awful lot to bring that about. But I think it's very important, as people who follow Russia, that we remember a very simple lesson about Russia. It's a very big country. It's a very big country, and despite all the tools, the arsenal that Russia's federal government has to exert its will across Russia, because it's a big country, it's not able to do that in a way that it's not able to do that very quickly. And so I think what I'd like you to take away from the presentation, the evidence that I've shared, is that we do see some signs in terms of political competition in the region, some civil society pushback in the form of these business organizations that are resisting the overreaching hand or the grabbing hand of the Russian state, which may give us reason for optimism about the future trajectory of Russia's political economy. So thank you very much. Yeah, Tanya.
Question. In Soviet times, and I remember it very well from different political jokes and stories, if someone wants to appeal, that there was some injustice done to him or her, they would either write a letter to Pravda, or they would appeal to the Communist Party committee of that particular plant or factory which offended you or hurt you in any way. If husband has an affair on the side, his wife most likely would write a letter to the party committee, and they would take an action. Usually it worked. From what I hear, and that's my question because I don't know, I understand very well that you're absolutely right about the joining business associations, and in the period when you're not really protected by law, when you cannot rely upon police. You used to rely upon mafia, which was more reliable in the 90s, but now, it's not an option anymore. So joining a business association might be a very good way to somehow protect yourself and your business. But what I hear from people in Russia now, that now it's becoming more and more productive not to join the business association, but to join the Единая Россия. In a way, it reminds me that tendency that if you're a governor and you don't want to lose your position, and the governors now are appointed, not elected as before, you have to join Единая Россия, the United Russia. If you want to make a career move, you have to join United Russia. If you want to lobby a law or something, anything to influence it on the level of Duma, of the parliament, you have to either join United Russia yourself or find someone who is active. And so doesn't it seem to you that this is kind of going back, reversing those wonderful trends which you pictured as a bright future? Thank you.
Should I take several questions or give a reference? Okay, great. I don't disagree with anything that you said. In fact, I came across a story from a Russian newspaper reading on Johnson's Russia list a couple days ago that the chairman of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, RSPP, recently came out to endorse very strongly Medvedev in the upcoming election, who of course is Putin's guy. There's obviously an interest felt by both non-members of associations as well as members and the associations themselves to put their finger up in the political winds, sense which way those winds are blowing, and respond accordingly. I don't dispute what you're saying about Единая Россия being very important to the political careers of joining Единая Россия as being important to the political careers of politicians. Yeah, I find very little to disagree with what you said, other than to maybe re-emphasize a point about, even though Единая Россия is an organization now through which a lot happens in Russia, there are other organizations through which things can happen. And we do see more and more, and I think this evidence that I've been showing points to, political officials in the regions, whether or not they belong to the party of power, the Yedina RCIA, reaching out to these other segments of society. Some political scientists have called this like an exchange relationship. Politicians benefit from their ties to the business community benefits from the ties to the politicians. I do have evidence from the surveys here, which I didn't show, that shows that there is somewhat of a, what we call in the Western political context, a revolving door, in the sense that who is leading these business associations? Well, oftentimes it's folks who are just out of a government agency. Oftentimes, the person who is the director of a particular business association has a seat in the regional Duma. And so there is an intertwining of the business and the political community. But I think just because there is that intertwining doesn't necessarily mean that the business community is effectively at the beck and call of state officials. I think it's a relationship that goes both ways. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to quibble with the idea of property rights. It sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is companies' ability to limit other people's access to them and their ability to organize to get access to the levers of state politics and so on. And I tend to think of property rights as things, objects, land, resources, fixed capital assets and stuff like that. And so I guess I'm thinking in terms of, it sounds like your story is about access to institutions rather than control of resources. And so I'm wondering if you could, I guess, tease apart what are the components you mean by property rights?
Well, we think of ownership as being a multidimensional bundle. There's the right to use an asset, there's the right to the income generated by that asset, and there's the right to dispose of the asset, sell or bequeath or throw it away if you want to. What I'm largely referring to here is that second right, the right to the income generated by the asset. So in the case of a firm, does the firm have the ability to use its physical assets, generate an income, and do with what it wants with that income? Okay? The rights to the residual income. Or is that residual income threatened by the grabbing hand of the state? Either because bureaucrats are asking for bribes, or you get government officials that capriciously are passing laws and regulations that aren't enforced uniformly across the business community. And yes, it even, in the case of some particularly small businesses, refers to the threat of outright expropriation of physical assets. So it's all of those. But the first part of your question goes to an issue that often comes up when I present this material. Is, we think of business associations. I talked about lobbying. We think about lobbying as a bad thing, right? I mean, a lot of us are listening to presidential debates now, and all the candidates, on both sides of the aisles are making a big deal about, putting an end to special interest influence in Washington, keeping the lobbyists at arm's length. And I'm talking about groups that are effectively lobbies for the business community in a way that's suggesting that maybe they're providing some social benefit. There's a long tradition in the social science literature that's very suspicious of business organizations. And this goes all the way back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, you can't even trust the business people in a particular community to manage the fund for widows and orphans in that community. You don't want them in charge of that, because once you give them a pretext for getting together, they're going to start colluding to limit the market, to limit competition, to put up entry barriers. And this kind of very suspicious attitude toward business organizations was picked up in the work of Mansur Olson, a political economist, who said one of the reasons that some of the victors in World War II were growing very slowly in the 1970s relative to the losers is because the victors still had their special interests intact, their special interest organizations after World War II. Japan and Germany, their special interests were decimated during World War II, and so they could grow quickly because you didn't have these special interest organizations that were devoting all sorts of resources to try to divide up an existing sized economic pie. Okay? But there's this alternative interpretation of what associations do, particularly when we're talking about countries or economic environments that are a long way from their potential. They're a long way from their potential. That is, that intra-business conflicts are much less likely when countries are a long way from their economic potential. When they're a long way from their economic potential, then the business community as a whole, different social groups as a whole, will be more easily, it's more easy to get them to agree as to what appropriate social and political reforms are when you're a long way from where you are, from your potential. Another thing that I'd just like to mention with respect to that is that these associations are truly open. They aren't closed. They aren't putting up their doors now that we're in this special organization that seems to be giving us influence and access. There's no evidence that I picked up in the surveys that firms are turned down. Firms that are willing to pay membership dues are excluded. And so that leads me to believe that these associations really are not of the Smith variety or the Olsonian variety, but they're more of this other variety, that they're pushing primarily, I can't make the argument that it's exclusively, but primarily for reforms that are making society as a whole better off. Most of the associations that I'm talking about aren't representing just a single sector even. They're representing firms from multiple sectors. And so they really have to agree across sectors as to what are the best interests in terms of policy, reform. Okay, that's a long-winded answer to a very good question. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I enjoyed your talk very much, and I think I heard an earlier version a couple of years ago, so I see how far you've gone now, and it's become more complex and more interesting as a result. So I appreciate it very much. I do have a question about each of these two sides of the equation that we're looking at. Political institutions and the degree of political competition. I wonder how you accommodate these trends. I mean, I realize that your bottom line was, well, Russia is a big country, there's centralization going on, but there are these vast regions out there where there's still a fair amount of political competition. And that's, I think, reasonable and persuasive. But we also know about the trends, right? And so 2-3 years ago when I heard your presentation, which was much more focused just on the business association, I was probably more optimistic than I am today in terms of the big question, where Russia is going. Because take the degree of political competition. In the light of the latest election 2-3 months ago, we probably have the least competitive environment we've had since 1991 in Russia. There's only one party now in the parliament which can reasonably be dubbed opposition. It is the Communist Party, and it has about 11% in the parliament. So that's a very adverse trend, which will undoubtedly translate into the regions too. I'd just like you to comment on that. And then in terms of the collective action and the role of the business association, I was struck by your question there. Well, what is it that leads these businesses to join the associations? What motivations do they have? And I'm brought back to Dmitry Trenin, a Russian expert whom we brought last year, I think, to visit here. And at that time, I was in Russia, so I missed his talk. But as I understand it, his argument is that the business of Russia today is business. That, you know, it's Russia is best understood as Russia Incorporated. The people who run the country own it. That's his thesis. So if that's the case, and Medvedev, as you know, was running Gazprom, now before he's going to run Russia, perhaps as an assistant to Putin. So it's not just that there are some collusions of interest,
It's that Russia is again emerging as a patrimonial state in which political and economic power are fused. So how accurate is that as kind of a story that we're now dealing with?
I think my response would be very similar to the one I gave to Tanya. I'm not trying to deny those trends that you're describing. I'm not trying to deny that they're real. What I'm suggesting is that there's some social forces that are pushing back a little bit that often get overlooked in the standard narrative of what's happening in Russia. And I don't think we should ignore those social forces, because ultimately the trajectory that Russia takes will be a function of both what happens at the center and what's happening in the periphery and in the grassroots. It's interesting that Medvedev, in a talk that he gave out in Krasnoyarsk last week, you mentioned that he's on the board, he's the CEO of Gazprom. But in the talk that he gave last week, he said that he's interested in reversing the trend of people with Kremlin ties being placed on the boards of some of Russia's largest companies. He said that's not what he's interested in. And that wasn't rebutted when Putin gave a talk later in the week. So I'm not sure, maybe there's something happening in the Kremlin right now when we think about the different influences on federal political power that is very difficult for us to tell. And, with my evidence here, my evidence only goes up to 2004. And that was before governors began to be appointed. And so my story is basically about 1995 to 2005. And we know a lot's happened on the centralization front since then, particularly with control over the media and in various administrative reforms. Kremlinology, this term that arose during the Soviet Union, is coming back in vogue. And it's sometimes, I think, difficult for us to read all the tea leaves of what's happening inside the Kremlin. And I'm not convinced that the trend that seems to have started in the past 2 or 3 years, because the second Putin administration, the second term, seems to have reversed away from some of the liberalizing tendencies, some of the liberalizing pieces of legislation that were passed between 2000 and 2004, and there's much greater tendency, I would agree with you, towards centralization. But is this necessarily going to be where Russia's headed in the next 2, 3, 4 years? I'm not sure. I really don't know. And I want to be kind of modest, and I don't want to be naive. But I just want to suggest that there are forces that are pushing back. And I don't think we should ignore that. And yes, United Russia is a powerful political force right now in Russia. And chances are that Medvedev will come in and get, 70, 75% of the popular vote during the presidential election in about a week's time. So it's not a competitive system at the federal level. But that overlays, or that covers, a lot of competition that's going on, and even press freedom in some of the regions. But you know what? I went to a lot of political panels. I'm trying to kind of get caught up on the political science stuff now, and I went to a lot of panels at the AASS meeting, our national meeting for Slavosis, about 2 months ago. And a lot of the political scientists there were talking about, well, yes, Russia is becoming a one-party state, but does that mean it's not democratic? What about Mexico, and what about Japan? These were countries that were effectively one-party states and functioned in some ways like a mature democracy. So it's possible to me, it's plausible that even with the growing role that United Russia is playing, and some of these other small parties never were really all that important on the national political scene anyway. Some of the ones that won't appear on the ballots for the presidential election or didn't make the cutoff, the electoral threshold. Some of the parties that, were kind of sympathetic in the West to their perspectives. They just haven't done a good job of organizing. And they've never really influenced the political trajectory. So the fact that they're not going to be represented in the presidential election or in the Duma, I'm not sure if that's that's going to make a big deal of difference for Russia's ultimate trajectory. Putin is very popular. You know, in many ways, I think Putin is more a product of Russia and what Russia wants than Russia is a product of Putin. Generally, the narrative that we hear in the Western press is that Putin has kind of fashioned this country according to his own preferences. But we forget that Putin is incredibly popular for the order that he's restored, for the economic growth that he's presided over, for the dramatic reduction in the poverty rate that he's presided over. And yes, you can make the argument that this was at a time of high oil prices, and Russia's obviously benefited from that, but he's been the guy. He's been the one on the watch there. And so I'm not as pessimistic. The point I want to make is really a relative one. I'm not as pessimistic about the trends in Russia as I think a lot of people in the West are. And I think there are some reasons. They might be small, but I just want to highlight those small reasons for optimism.
Great. Well, unfortunately,